Okay, so we'll move to a Q&A. We have a question already, and if anyone wants to would prefer to unmute and just ask here on the Zoom call rather than in the chat, that's also perfectly fine. So we'll start with a question that looks like it's for you, Kim. Katrina Leahy asks, if still sane seems to offer a model of how aesthetic form is all about the enactment of theme, could other speakers, oh sorry, it's for everyone, oh, surprise. Could other speakers comment on the extent to which, if at all, thematic aspects of feeling enclosed, reacting to boundaries also impact on the aesthetic form in which those concerns are expressed? And this question has a particular resonance, Kieran, I suspect, when the critical response is in the form of a poem. So thanks, Katrina, for kicking us off with a whole round. I suppose, Kieran, we'll go to you first and maybe go through the speakers boringly in order.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just thanks again to fellow panelists. That was wonderful. And also Katrina for the question. I might, this may be more an evasion than an answer, but I might just signal Tom Paulin's essays on John Clare, on his work. People like Seamus Heaney and Robert Macfarlane are also very erudite and eloquent interpreters of Clare's work, but I think Paulin, particularly in his book Minotaur, in his discussion of Clare, he manages to recognize the kind of linguistic vitality and the demotic sources of Clare's work, while at the same time relating those qualities to I suppose, the material and political tribulations that he's going through. And he claims Clare as a kind of a subversive in every sense, kind of poetically radical, politically inclined and socially conscious writer. And likewise, someone like Seamus Heaney in a kind of softer mode will claim Clare's vernacular energies as a kind of subversive example that allowed him to claim, or to claim his own kind of local language and landscape in the North as a kind of common ground transcending sectarian divisions, if you like, in his locality. Sorry, that's probably a tangent, but yeah, I think the kind of pressure between form and a kind of general theme is a live one in Clare's work.
Fantastic, and thanks so much, Kieran. I feel you've probably taken points from everyone there, but I'll still go around just in case people have things they want to add. So Lisa, do you have?
Yeah, that was a really interesting question. I was like, can I come back to you guys tomorrow with like an email? No, I think so. I did mention in the presentation, in the narrative of the poem itself, there are modern readings of how boundaries present there. I think just in terms of how Apollonius is in many ways crossing a boundary by allowing us insight in this particular focalization on Medea's interior monologues. But also it just struck me the kind of irony that Apollonius in many ways brings us closer to Medea compared to what Euripides could within the limits of his form, the dramatic form, but also the irony in how there was, or seems to have been, very much a barrier between Euripides' play and the audience who was viewing it. But yeah, I would just reiterate what I said. I mean, the boundaries themselves may not have been a primary concern of Apollonius the poet as he was exploring Medea's crisis, but we can certainly, as I pointed out in the presentation, there are a lot of readings and a lot of ways modern scholars have read boundaries in the form of the narrative itself. So.
Fantastic. John, do you also want to come in on this? I was thinking in your talk about the short form, short stories as opposed to novels, and I'm sure there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I suppose I had mentioned it, but I hadn't quite considered the impact of form on, or the choice of form, I suppose, that Forster picked out for his exploration of boundaries or feeling enclosed. And it does certainly appear that his more impulsive reactions, his more belligerent reactions are better suited to the short story, whereas that kind of search for compromise, which is so well known for, does appear that it's almost like he needed more space, more breadth, more depth, which the novel kind of offers, and the short story doesn't always, I suppose. so yeah, it's interesting that there's that kind of I suppose paradoxical element there, that things are more liberated within the more narrow constraints of a short story, but that does seem to be the ideal for him as a writer, certainly.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And Kim, I'm sure you also have a lot to say about this. I was thinking there, the last image that you showed of the five sculptures in red, it really reminded me of The Dancers by, I think, Matisse or something, with kind of, I was going to ask that what the artistic influences were, or kind of where, even how these sculptures came about. I maybe missed whether they were, because in ways they look like cats, in other ways so please take it away.
Yeah, actually that invites for me an opportunity to answer this question, responding to you, Connor, about how the sculptures were produced. Ulrich Bauer has a quote. I come to his work from Wendy Hesford's Spectacle of Distant Suffering, but something about how when you're representing trauma, the recording has to demonstrate its awareness of the imprint of the recording on its own messaging. So being sort of meta-reflective. And I think that is really evident and resonant in Still Sane, because the sculptures were produced by encasing Sheila in something like 30 pounds of wet cement, in order that these are plaster molds of her form. And Persimmon Blackbridge, the artist, manipulated in order to get the final images that we see. But for Sheila, that's a literal reenactment of being kept in place. It's being re-imprisoned in the experience of trying to break out and break free. So it's really powerful testimonial, not just to see the works, in their, sort of final circulation, but to understand the process of their making and what that means for a kind of, resistant expression of the carceral experience or carceral encounter.
Yeah, well, that really that adds a whole other layer to what we're seeing there. So yeah, that's a great question and great responses all around.
I was going to say that could be a pun. It adds many layers. 30 pounds, 30 pounds on Sheila's body.
And don't tempt me with puns. Honestly, we'll be here all day. So a question for Lisa. Ralph asks, given that Apollonius's construction of a thought and emotion process of unparalleled detail for Medea, but given that this is who's a foreign woman in his poetry, could this reflect an effort to translate the thought world of a marginal figure for his Greek male audience, whose own thought and feeling processes could be assumed through normativity? Yeah, that's for you, Lisa. Oh,
I'm so sorry. I muted myself again so I wouldn't make a noise, and I just created more complications. And thank you so much for that question. Yeah, well, my way of answering that would be first to take us back to Euripides, who, because again, there's a lot of discussion of, the majority of Euripides' plays have women's names as the title, and, there's discussion of feminism and to what extent he was a feminist author and all that stuff. But basically, if we start with tragedy, which precedes Apollonius's poem, Greek theatre offered these authors a space to explore the other and what, be it marginalized figures like Medea. So Euripides is kickstarting that process of, the tensions that Euripides was very much aware of in his society, and exploring what happens if those tensions kind of break free in a figure like Medea. Euripides very much kickstarted this interest, in psychology that was picked up on by Apollonius and other authors of his period. So this is the Hellenistic period following the death of Alexander the Great. So yeah, I would definitely agree that, and again, it is an interesting tension, because you have this male author who, to give him credit, is clearly, an intelligent and capable guy, but very convincingly and effectively rendering this depiction of a woman in crisis. And to talk about his male audience, if you look at the ancient commentators on Apollonius's poem, they are all thoroughly convinced by the depiction of Medea. and think it's very thorough and very consistent, and this is exactly what happens. And they say it's a very convincing picture of ta erotica, of love. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of looking at that, Ralph, for sure. And I would remind you again, it's not without precedent. We have Sappho, the archaic poet, who is writing about, the female poet who's writing about the effects of love, both physical effects and mentally. At the time Apollonius is writing, it's again after the death of Alexander the Great. So it's the Ptolemaic period when you have very prominent female royal figures. So there's more of an interest there. You can look at how that context has influenced Apollonius's poem, because the way modern readers have looked at that poem is to say, well, this is great, but Medea's depiction is kind of the highlight, but seems kind of out of place in the rest of the poem, which is essentially a travel narrative as they sail on their way home. So for modern readers, it's taken us quite some time to wrap our heads around it. But for the ancient readers and the ones commenting, they, as Ralph said, are thoroughly convinced. And Apollonius is building on the work done by Euripides and this interest in psychology and the psyche, the soul, the mind, and yeah, exploring that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Ralph.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's it's always great within this kind of boundary crossing interdisciplinary setting to hear two people from the same discipline start to get immersed in a more detailed discussion. That's really, I can't always follow, but it's fun to watch. Kim's just indicated to me that she has a question as well, which I think we may as well cover here in the call.
Great, thanks. I don't know if other folks have questions as well, but if not, mine are small. Kieran, it was so nice, like it was really powerful to hear your work. And again, my question is kind of a small one. It's always interesting to hear an artist, a poet, a writer speak about their process. And there was one moment where in the poem, you have this word, it is, or this phrase, my own unpeasant. I was just thinking about the prefix un, and, you know, its meaning in the English language, you know, as not or other than, or as a kind of reversal, a removal. And I'm wondering if there's something particular about the use of un with peasant there in the work that you are giving here. It's my understanding of un is that it's not an actually very common prefix. People are more likely to use not, for example. So I'm just wondering if you had anything you might want to say about that.
Thank you so much, Kim. I love the specificity of that question, the attentiveness behind it. So I really appreciate that. To be completely honest, my intention using unpeasant was just kind of acknowledge in a concise way the vast differences between my own life and situation and John Clare's, because I think that is important. Also, you're right though that the un it's as a kind of as a truncation, if you like, it can kind of undo. I'm interested in this idea actually of verbal violence, which relates, Lisa, I think to what you were saying about the word atimos having a double meaning, so meaning without honor, but also without civil rights. And it just struck me that this verbal ambiguity is actually a sign of political violence, if you like, or it's got very clear political consequences, right? So yeah, I'm not sure that I particularly like the unit of unpeasant. I think it's kind of gruff and a little bit violent, maybe, but maybe that's part of the point. I'm not sure. But in any case, thanks for the question. Okay.
I'll just say, as a reader, I felt, you know, that self-other relation sort of, and you know, the resonance of what it means to be recognized, you know, peasant, you know, in the kind of structures we have in place. I feel like that was very resonant. So thank you, Kieran. I also have a question for Lisa, unless other folks do as well. Lisa, this is one of those terrible questions because it's sort of outside the wonderful work that you gave us. But I'm just wondering, because I'm not sure what else I have to offer, if you've encountered the work of Artemisia Gentileschi. I think she was a 17th century, I think 17th century Italian painter. Other people might know better than I do. But she has done kind of, I believe, what folks have called a feminist rendering of Medea in art. And I'm just wondering if you have encountered those kinds of feminist readings of Medea in works other than what you've given us, and maybe also to put on your register, if it isn't already there, Artemisia Gentileschi's work.
Thank you so much. I hadn't come across her work. I'll certainly be Googling that on the break. I had, in kind of preparing for this paper, I came across a poem by Augusta Webster called Medea in Athens. So I'll have to double check the date. I believe she's an American poet. I was looking at modern reception in that sense, but and obviously there are quite a few, well, there's, Medea has been represented in art numerous times, but it's always great to get those tips about feminist representations. But yeah, I came across a poem by Augusta Webster, who's a 19th century poet, that I was reading in the lead up. But certainly, thank you very much for that tip. And I might just build on what Kieran said about the verbal ambiguity, if that's all right, Connor, just for a sec, because that's one of just the great things about Greek, you guys, is that there's just, it can mean, so one word can mean like 5 million different things. But you're absolutely right in that the verbal ambiguity in that context does have consequences. And when you look at Medea in Euripides' play, when she's speaking to the audience, to the chorus, it's almost like a law speech. You know what I mean? That's the great thing when all of these different terms can have many different connotations. She's presenting her case and explaining in very clear terms why Jason has broken his oath and to her and their agreement. And that's why it's really interesting that one word like atimos, and tima is such a central concept to Greek literature, this concept of honor. It's very integral to Greek ethics, but it can also have this connotation of this legal connotation of a woman who has had her civil rights deprived. So yeah, thank you for picking up on that. And thank you, Kim, for the wonderful tip there. I'll certainly look up her art. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, I've held back long enough. I have questions, and I've restrained myself this entire time. But I think now it should be allowed. But the main question I have really is for you, John, which is about. I really liked even the painting that you showed with Forster just off in the margins, quite literally. I love this idea of being an Edwardian among modernists or being in the wrong time. And I work on contemporary literature, and it's one of the problems that I have a lot is how to relate to something that's sharing the same time as you. And one thing that you come across a lot is this idea of, I think starting from Nietzsche and the idea of untimeliness, that the only way to really see the moment you're living in is to be out of step with it. That's kind of the only way to be truly contemporary, is not to quite be born in the right time. And I'm just wondering whether you see that as something that's going on with Forster a lot as well. Whether the kind of queer elements that you were discussing today fit in well with being socially or stylistically out of step in time, or not quite being in your own time.
Yeah, I think that's something that could certainly be applied to Forster. I think as he was writing as a young man during the Edwardian period, he often felt a Victorian. He had a very kind of domestic, female-led household growing up, and it was rooted in a lot of kind of liberal Victorian tradition. So he felt out of time there. But then I would say the very nature of being a kind of closeted homosexual at the time and looking forward to a more liberal society meant he was also out of step with the Edwardians as well. So yeah, I think he's very much someone who doesn't fit in. He's often described by critics and this refers to kind of Forster specialists and general literary critics as someone at the edge or on the kind of fringe of society. He very rarely sort of stepped into a specific role without feeling reticent about it. And even today, much of my research is kind of looking at how we read Forster as someone who didn't really write that much gay fiction, and so isn't included in queer modules at universities and stuff like that. But he very much does deviate from social norms within his Edwardian fiction, despite that kind of reputation and appearance of being a dusty old white man that Merchant Ivory have kind of cemented for him, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that there's a lot more to be said there, but certainly in terms of the short stories and things, I think there was a kind of very hidden secret desire to be subversive without being explicitly subversive as he would like.
Yeah, for sure. The kind of love that dare not speak its name effect there, that maybe is also what you're, what you were getting at with saying that these elements come out most in the short fiction, or something about that suppression. But I think, yeah, it is almost, I think it was someone like Thomas Mann as well, or like, it's a shame to keep him off certain modules just because of what is or isn't explicitly in the text. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And I do have a sort of follow-up for you, Lisa, on that. It's just that, as someone so far outside classics, kind of the opposite end of the time spectrum, I was wondering kind of sort of in two directions, that on the one hand, it seems as though readings like yours that are taking identity politics and kind of, not to label it in that way, but that are kind of excavating those types of issues from much older stories, that those might be a fairly recent phenomenon in classics. So sort of like from now looking back, and I was kind of wondering, when you were talking about anxiety as well, about what the much older stories and forms have to say about kind of the fact that we now are much more set in our mental health discourse or whatever. We're much more sure of how to label things, even kind of whether you think that troubles our modern conceptions a bit, or do they kind of affirm one another?
Thank you for that question. I would say, so just the first part of your question and modern readings, I was at an event once, and there was a lecturer who's just very prominent in Greek literature, and he was essentially confirmed that we're all just providing the same readings over and over again. So, and that made me feel both good and bad. But so I think, in terms of modern theoretical readings, sure, in terms of imposing 19th, 20th century theory onto ancient Greek literature, there's been a big push in narratological readings and ancient Greek literature as one example. But I do think that it's not hugely innovative, and that these texts, we are still reading them for a reason. The reason we have a lot of these texts is because scribes and scholars in the Byzantine and medieval periods were copying them down, and they were a huge part of the educational system from the 3rd century BC all the way down to the end of the Byzantine period. So it would be a bit bogus of me to say, oh yes, this reading I just talked you guys through today, that's it. That was all me. So I do think there is a nice balance between modern readings and theoretical approaches, but also to point out that really these texts have been studied intently since the very moment they were written, essentially. And the second part, in terms of our modern vocabulary for mental health, again, I'm not sure there is a tension, because so much of, I focus on ancient Greek language and literature especially. It really does inform so much of our value system and our language as well. There is an interesting language around psychology, and also an ambiguity in ancient Greek literature. For instance, the location of your soul and your mind and your heart is really kind of in the stomach area, and it can all be interchanged. So, which makes a lot of sense, really, because if you're feeling anxiety, where do you feel it? You feel it here. So in many ways, there's continuity, and there's interesting developments in the language and how we describe that. But also I would speak again to the fact that maybe there isn't a whole lot different in how we articulate those kind of concerns today compared to how they did. I don't want to conflate, because there's a tendency, and it's a big problem, just thinking of, I don't know, Boris Johnson, to this idea of legacy from ancient Greek literature and culture. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the influences of language, and again, these texts which were taught so consistently. So maybe there's not a complete difference, but we're working off the framework maybe that's already there that we've read about to articulate our own identities and concerns in our society. But I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of tension in how they used to, because although they mightn't have got the the physics of it right, of where your heart, where the feelings are actually coming from, they got the sense of it right, because they were working off human emotions and feelings. I hope that answers your question.
It does, yeah, and I loved that part of your talk, giving the I thought it was kind of telling that you went for the original words when referring to body parts, or like you gave it that importance that really made you stop and pay attention. So that was brilliant. I know we're kind of wrapping up, but I just very last quick question to Kieran, just about what it was like to read poetry on Zoom, to screen share it as well. I think even this question about on and own, it, like where maybe if you'd been reading, the person might not have known exactly what the phrasing was or something. Do you find, is there a certain poetry in it, or are you kind of looking forward to the bookshops and the physical readings again?
Sorry, thank you so much. I keep muting myself because Leitrim is much noisier than it ever was before. But yeah, no, I think there's a kind of happy irony and kind of speaking to myself and into the void while at the same time being connected to all of you. It probably works quite well with the themes of the conference as well, like this idea of kind of atomization and connection, both in the most hyper forms, kind of congregating together. But yeah, to be honest, it was a total delight to be able to read the poem and to be part of the discussion. So yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me again.
Yeah, lovely to have you. And yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there a little bit ahead of time and just have a half hour break. So thank you again to all the fabulous speakers. Those are really great talks, and I'll hand over to whichever of the organizers and or James wants to halt proceedings for the time being.
Thanks so much to everyone. This has just been like really excellent first panel. Thanks so much to Connor for chairing that in such an interesting and illuminating way. Thanks also James for introducing us. We're going to go on our break now until 12:30, and just thanks so much to all the panelists for such a all-encompassing, really varied, interesting first discussion of boundaries. I'm just really looking forward to the rest of it, and I'll see you all soon. And so will Tom. Tom, do you want to say anything? We'll just cool.
Yeah, I'll be here to man the chat if anyone has any questions or issues, but we're going to leave it open throughout the break. You can come in and out, that's no problem. It's the same link. So you could, camera off and mute, or you could leave and come back. It's not a problem.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll see you all shortly.